Jake trudged through the thick snow, his boots crunching with every step. The wind howled, biting into his face as he pulled his thick coat tighter around him. He had been on patrol for hours, checking the outskirts of the settlement for any signs of trouble. This planet, while beautiful, was harsh. The cold was unforgiving, and the only warmth came from the small campfires scattered around the colony. But today the cold felt sharper than usual. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. He paused, looking around the snowy landscape. The wide-open plains stretched out for miles, nothing but white as far as the eye could see. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with the promise of more snow. Jake sighed and checked his watch. He should head back soon. But then, something caught his attention, a flicker of movement in the distance. At first, he thought it was just the wind stirring up the snow, but then it moved again. A figure, barely visible against the white backdrop, was stumbling across the ice. Jake's heart raced. No one should be out here, especially in weather this severe. The figure was moving slowly, as though struggling to stay on their feet. Without thinking, Jake broke into a run. His breath came out in sharp bursts, mixing with the cold air. As he got closer, he saw it was a woman. She was hunched over, her hands pressed against her sides, as though trying to hold herself together against the cold. Her skin glowed faintly in the dim light, giving her an almost ethereal quality. She was dressed in what appeared to be alien clothing, sleek and metallic, but torn and covered in snow. Jake's mind raced. What was she doing here? How had she gotten so far out in the cold? As he reached her, he could see she was shaking violently, her lips blue and her eyes wide with fear. She looked at him, but her gaze seemed unfocused, as though she were struggling to stay awake. "Hey!" Jake called out, his voice muffled by the wind. "Are you okay? What happened?" The woman's body swayed slightly, and she took a step forward, but her legs gave way beneath her. Jake rushed to catch her, his arms wrapping around her waist to steady her. She was freezing, her body cold to the touch, and her breathing shallow. Her eyes met his, full of confusion and fear. "I am lost," she whispered, her voice weak. Jake's heart tightened. "You're not lost. You're safe now. Come on, let's get you out of the cold." He lifted her gently, cradling her in his arms. She didn't protest, too weak to do anything but rest her head against his chest. He moved quickly, heading toward the shelter of his small cabin on the edge of the settlement. The snowstorm was picking up again, and Jake knew they had to get inside before they were completely buried. The trek back to his cabin felt like it took forever. The wind howled and the snow fell harder, but Jake pressed on, determined to get her somewhere safe. He could feel the weight of her body in his arms, her breathing slow and labored. She was barely conscious now, and Jake was afraid she might slip away if he didn't get her help soon. Finally, he reached his cabin. He kicked the door open with his foot, grateful for the warmth inside. He carried her over to the bed, carefully laying her down. As he moved to gather blankets, he noticed the strange markings on her skin, almost like tattoos, but unlike anything he had ever seen. Her clothing, though futuristic, was torn and stained with what looked like blood. Jake shook his head, pushing the thought aside. Now wasn't the time to worry about the details. He had to focus on getting her warm. He draped the blankets over her and started a fire in the small stove, watching as the flames flickered to life. The warmth filled the room, slowly pushing back the chill of the cold night outside. He kept an eye on her, noticing how her breathing became steadier, the tremors in her body lessening. After a few minutes, the woman's eyes fluttered open. She blinked, her gaze landing on Jake. There was a moment of confusion, and then her eyes widened. "You're human?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Jake nodded. "Yeah, I'm human. You're safe now." The woman's eyes darted around the room, as though she were trying to make sense of her surroundings. She tried to sit up, but Jake gently pushed her back down. "Rest," he said softly. "You've been through a lot. Just relax." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, she nodded. Double quotes. Thank you, she murmured. I don't know how I ended up out there. I don't remember. Jake frowned, feeling a sense of unease. You don't remember? How did you get out there? She shook her head. I don't know, 1 minute I was with my crew and then I was alone. I don't remember anything after that. Jake sat beside her, his brow furrowed with concern. Something didn't add up, but he didn't want to press her further, not when she was so weak. He could ask questions later, when she was feeling better. I'll take care of you, Jake said, trying to offer reassurance. You're not alone anymore. You're safe here. The woman closed her eyes, as though the weight of the world had lifted off her shoulders. Jake watched her, unsure of what would come next. There was something about her that intrigued him, something mysterious and unknown. But for now, all that mattered was that she was safe. As the fire crackled in the corner and the storm raged outside, Jake made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't let anything happen to her, not while she was under his roof. The morning light crept through the small window of the cabin, casting a soft glow over the room. Jake had stayed up late, keeping watch over the mysterious woman who was still recovering from her ordeal. The fire had kept the room warm, but her condition had worried him. She had slept through the night, her body still wrapped in the blankets, but there was an uneasy stillness about her. Jake wanted to make sure she was okay. He walked over to the stove and stirred the pot of soup. He had started earlier. The aroma filled the air, a comforting scent in the cold morning. He poured a bowl, trying to make sure everything was just right before waking her up. He set the bowl on a small table next to the bed, then hesitated for a moment before gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Hey, it's time to wake up, Jake said softly, his voice calm. The woman stirred, her eyes slowly opening. She blinked a few times, as though adjusting to the light. When she saw Jake, she seemed startled for a moment, but then her expression softened. She looked at him, confused, as if trying to piece together where she was. How do you feel? Asked, his tone gentle. She swallowed, her throat dry. Better, she whispered, her voice still hoarse from the cold. I think I was dreaming, probably, Jake replied with a small smile. But you're safe now. I made you some soup. Should help you feel stronger. Her eyes flickered to the bowl of soup on the table. She hesitated for a moment before sitting up. Jake moved to help her, but she shook her head gently. I can do it, she said, her voice gaining a bit of strength. She slowly pulled the blanket away and swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet touched the cold floor, and she shivered. Slightly, but she didn't seem to mind. Jake watched as she carefully stood up. A little wobbly at first, but she steadied herself. You're stronger than you look, he said with admiration. The woman gave him a small smile. I've been through worse. She walked over to the table and sat down, taking the bowl of soup in her hands. Jake stood nearby, watching her closely as she took her first sip. She closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the warmth and comfort of the meal. It seemed like she hadn't had something warm in a long time. Thank you, she said quietly, looking up at Jake. Jake nodded. You don't need to thank me. It's the least I can do. For a few moments they sat in silence, the crackling of the fire and the gentle wind outside filling the room. Jake could tell she was still thinking, trying to piece together what had happened to her. The memory loss was concerning, but he didn't want to push her too hard. She had been through a lot already. Finally, the woman spoke again. I remember something, she said, her voice distant. I was on a ship with my crew. But then, nothing. It's like everything disappeared. Jake leaned against the wall, arms crossed. What kind of ship were you on? The woman's eyes locked. Onto his, and for a moment Jake thought he saw fear in her gaze. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. It was a research vessel, she explained slowly. We were mapping out planets for exploration, but I don't know what happened after that. I don't remember how I ended up on this planet. Jake frowned. Something about her story didn't sit right with him, but he wasn't about to press. She had already been through enough. It's okay. You're safe here for now. She nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she set the bowl down. I don't know how to repay you, she said, her voice quiet but sincere. Jake shrugged. Don't worry about it. I'm just glad you're okay. The silence returned, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Jake could sense that the woman was trying to process everything that had happened. It was clear she wasn't used to relying on others. And that made Jake wonder about her past. As the day went on, Jake and the woman, who he had yet to learn the name of, spent time getting to know each other better. He gave her more details about the colony, explaining the local culture and the small community of settlers that lived there. In turn, she shared what little she could remember about her mission and the planet she came from. The more they talked, the more Jake realized how different their lives were. But there was a shared understanding between them. Both of them were strangers in an unfamiliar place. Later, Jake went out to gather some firewood, leaving the woman to rest. As he stepped outside, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The storm from the previous night had passed, but there was an eerie quiet in the air. He couldn't explain it, but something felt ... wrong. He glanced over his shoulder, almost expecting the woman to be watching him from the window, but there was nothing. The cabin stood silent in the cold light of the afternoon. When Jake returned to the cabin, he found the woman sitting near the fire, staring into the flames. She had taken off her metallic clothing and was wrapped in the thick blankets. There was something calming about the way she looked in that moment, vulnerable, but not broken. She looked at peace, and Jake felt a warmth in his chest at the sight. "I'm sorry about before," she said quietly as Jake entered. "I didn't mean to cause you trouble." Jake shook his head, walking over to the fire. "You didn't cause any trouble? You needed help, and I'm glad I could offer it." The woman gave him a grateful smile, though it seemed tinged with sadness. "I never expected to end up here, alone." Jake sat down beside her, the warmth of the fire heating his skin. "Not alone anymore. As long as you're here, you're not alone." She nodded, the weight of the words settling between them. For a brief moment, they both just sat there, watching the flames dance in silence. Despite everything that had happened, there was something comforting about being together in that small cabin. No more unknowns, just the simple warmth of a human connection. As the evening wore on, Jake began to feel a sense of peace. He had done the right thing in helping her, but he couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Was she truly safe? And if not, what danger lay ahead for them both? The next few days passed slowly, but Jake couldn't help but notice how quickly the woman, whom he had learned was named Alisara, was recovering. Her energy was coming back in small bursts, and her once fragile body was starting to regain its strength. She seemed to enjoy the small, quiet moments in the cabin times when the fire crackled and they shared stories, or when the two of them simply enjoyed the calm after the storm. They had quickly fallen into a routine, one that felt natural despite the odd circumstances each morning. Jake would check on Alisara, making sure she had everything she needed. She spent most of her time in the cabin, either resting or reading through some of the books Jake had on his shelves. At first, she struggled to read English, but she quickly picked it up. The look of concentration on her face as she flipped through the pages made Jake smile. He often caught himself watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. There was something about her presence, an unspoken grace that made him feel at ease. In the evenings, after the work was done, they would sit by the fire and talk. Alisara spoke about her life before the crash of the planet she came from, her people, and her purpose in space. She was an explorer, a scientist, studying the far reaches of the galaxy. Her people, the Orlan, were peaceful by nature, but they had been forced to travel far and wide, seeking knowledge and understanding. She shared stories of her crew, of the adventures they had, and of the wonders they had seen in the stars. Jake would listen intently, fascinated by her tales. It was hard for him to imagine a life beyond Earth-1 that involved traveling to distant planets and discovering new worlds. His life had always been simple, focused on surviving in the cold, harsh environments of the colony. Listening to Alisara's stories made him dream of a different world, one filled with adventure and endless possibilities. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Alisara asked Jake a question that surprised him. Why did you help me? She asked, her voice soft but steady. Jake looked up from the fire, meeting her eyes. I don't know, he said honestly. Just felt like the right thing to do. You were alone, cold. I couldn't just leave you out there. Alisara studied him for a moment, as though weighing his words. Most people wouldn't have done the same, she said, her expression thoughtful. Jake shrugged. I guess I'm not most people. Alisara smiled at that, a small, appreciative smile that made Jake's heart skip a beat. It was a smile that didn't feel like it belonged to a stranger, but to someone who had come to trust him, someone who had begun to rely on him. Thank you, she said quietly. You've saved my life. Jake felt a warmth spread through him at her words, but there was also a hint of something else, something deeper. He had been helping her because it felt like the right thing to do, but now that she was healing, he realized that he was starting to feel something more for her. It was subtle at first, just a quiet pull of connection, but it was there. Growing with each passing day, the next day Alisara insisted on helping Jake with the chores around the cabin. She had been resting for so long, and though her body was still recovering, she wanted to feel useful. At first, Jake had protested, but she was determined. She had a strength that he had only seen in the bravest of people. He admired that about her. Together, they worked through the tasks. Alisara helped gather firewood, and Jake showed her how to tend to the small vegetable garden he had started. They worked in silence, each focused on their tasks, but there was a sense of peace between them. There was something comforting about sharing those simple moments working together, side by side. It felt natural, as though they had known each other far longer than just a few days. As they worked, Alisara's hand brushed against Jake's as they reached for the same pile of firewood. For a brief moment, their fingers touched. Neither of them pulled away immediately. Alisara's gaze flickered to his, her eyes reflecting a soft understanding. Jake felt his heart race, but he didn't know why. It was just a touch, nothing more. But it felt like something important, something that had changed between them. Later that evening, they sat together at the table, eating the meal they had prepared. The air between them felt different, charged with an unspoken connection. Jake wasn't sure what to make of it, but he couldn't deny that something had shifted. You've been very patient with me, Alisara said after a while, her voice quieter than usual. I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you. I'm not from your world, and yet you've taken me in, cared for me without question. Jake met her gaze. You're not the first person I've helped, he said, though he wasn't sure if that was entirely true. In some ways, this felt different. It wasn't just about helping someone in need. There was a deeper bond forming between them, one that was hard to ignore. Alisara nodded, her eyes searching his face. I wish I could explain everything to you. My people, my mission, why I was alone, ... But I'm still trying to piece it all together myself. Jake nodded in understanding. You don't have to explain anything to me. I'm just glad you're here and that you're safe. That's all that matters right now. Alisara smiled softly. I think I'm starting to believe that too. After they finished their meal, they sat by the fire once more. The flames flickered and crackled in the silence, casting long shadows across the room. As Jake glanced at Alisara, he saw something in her eyes, something more than just gratitude. It was as if she had found a place of peace, a home, even if it wasn't where she had expected. In the weeks to come, their bond only deepened. They shared more than just stories. They shared parts of themselves that they had never shown to anyone else. Jake found himself looking forward to each day, to the time they spent together. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had found something worth holding on to. The days seemed to blur together as Jake and Alisara grew more comfortable in each other's company. The cabin, once a place of solitude and quiet, now felt like home for both of them. Alisara had started helping Jake in ways that went beyond just the physical tasks. She shared stories from her past, teaching him about the galaxy she came from, about the stars and planets she had explored, and the people she had known. In turn, Jake taught her about Earth's the simple joys of life here, the beauty of the wilderness, and the quiet rhythm of their daily routines. But despite the warmth between them, There was an unease that neither of them could shake. It started as a feeling, a chill that seemed to settle in the air, even on the warmest days. Lasara had been growing more distant lately, and Jake could sense that something was bothering her. She often stared out the window, her expression lost in thought, as if she were listening to something far off in the distance. Jake hadn't pressed her, not wanting to push her when she wasn't ready to talk. But he couldn't ignore the fact that something was wrong. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Alisara suddenly stood up, her eyes wide with panic. "I hear them," she said, her voice trembling. "They're close." "Ow." Jake stood up quickly, concern spreading through him. "Who? What's going on?" Alisara's face was pale, her body tense. She looked toward the window, her gaze fixed on the darkening sky outside. "My people, my crew, they're not gone. They're looking for me." Jake's heart raced. He could see the fear in her eyes, and it made him uneasy. "Alisara, what are you talking about?" She turned to face him, her hands clenched at her sides. "I thought I was the only one left. But I was wrong. There are others, and they won't stop until they find me." Jake stepped closer to her, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're safe here. They won't hurt you." "I won't. Let them." Gah. Alisara shook her head, a bitter smile on her face. "You don't understand. They're not just after me. They're after something much bigger." Before Jake could respond, there was a loud thud against the door, followed by a rattling noise. Both of them froze, the sound cutting through the silence of the cabin like a knife. Jake's instincts kicked in, grabbed a nearby rifle and moved toward the door. Alisara followed him, her expression tense. "They found us," she whispered. The door shook again, the sound of heavy footsteps coming closer. Jake's mind raced. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard. He had no idea who or what was outside, but he knew one thing for sure: they weren't friendly. "Alisara, stay back," he ordered, though the words sounded weak even to him. He didn't want her to get hurt. The last thing he wanted was for her to be in danger because of him. But Alisara didn't listen. She stepped forward, her eyes determined. "I'm not going to hide. They'll never stop coming for me. You have to understand that." Jake didn't have time to argue. The door cracked open with a force that sent him stumbling back. He raised his rifle, ready to defend them both, but when the door swung wide, he found himself staring at nothing. The cold wind swept through the open door, carrying with it the smell of the ice and snow outside. But there was no one there, no enemy. No ship, no force that he could see. Jake hesitated, lowering his rifle, confusion settling in. What the hell's going on? Jake muttered to himself. Alisara stepped forward, her gaze still fixed on the open door. She didn't seem surprised. Instead, there was a look of resignation on her face. "They've only just begun," she said quietly. Jake looked at her, his confusion deepening. "What do you mean?" Alisara turned to him, her face a mix of frustration and sadness. "You don't understand. The people who are after me, my enemies are not just some rogue group or bandits. They are a powerful faction, and they have the resources to track me down across the galaxy. They'll stop at nothing to capture me." Jake's mind raced. He had thought the danger had passed, that the worst of it was over. But now it was clear that they were in more trouble than he had imagined. "Is there anything we can do?" Jake asked, his voice steady, though the fear in his chest was hard to ignore. Alisara paused, looking down at the floor. "I don't know," she whispered. "They have ships, advanced technology. I don't even know how they found me here." Jake clenched his fists. "We'll figure it out." "I'm not going to let anyone hurt you, Alisara." Alisara looked at him, her eyes softening. "Thank you, Jake, but you need to understand. It won't be easy. I can't hide forever. Eventually they'll find us, and when they do, ... Her voice trailed off, leaving the rest of the sentence unsaid. Jake felt a wave of determination wash over him. He had come this far to protect her, and he wasn't about to stop now. The thought of Alisara being taken, or worse, filled him with a cold rage. He wasn't going to let that happen. "We'll figure this out together," Jake said firmly. "We'll make sure you're safe." The wind howled again outside, and the cabin seemed to grow colder. Jake could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let Alisara face this alone. They had come this far, and he was going to do everything in his power to protect her. The wind outside grew colder, and the storm seemed to return with a vengeance, howling like an animal in the dark. Inside the cabin, Jake and Alisara were both on edge. The calm they had once enjoyed was shattered, replaced by an uneasy tension that neither of them could ignore. The mysterious threat that had loomed over them was now too real to deny. Alisara's warning about the people searching for her echoed in Jake's mind. He knew their time was running out. They spent the next few hours preparing. Alisara showed Jake the hidden compartments in her clothing where she had kept small high-tech devices, things that were part of her mission but could be used now for survival. She handed him a small device, a kind of tracker, and explained how it could detect any movement nearby. "They will try to approach us undercover," she said, her voice steady but tinged with concern. "We need to be ready. If they find us, we won't be able to escape easily." Jake nodded, gripping the device tightly. "What else can we do?" Alisara paused, her expression turning grim. "I know the layout of this area, if we make it. To the cliffs, there's a cave that might protect us from their scanners, but we'll have to move fast. They'll send scouts first, then the rest will follow." Jake thought about it. The cliffs were far. It wasn't an easy trek through the frozen wilderness, and it would mean leaving the safety of the cabin. Staying put wasn't an option. The enemy would come for them. They wouldn't stop until they had Alisara. "We'll go to the cliffs," Jake said, determination clear in his voice. "But we need to be smart about this. Can't just rush out there without a plan." Alisara nodded, clearly relieved that Jake was on the same page. "I know a way through the woods that can help us avoid being seen. But we have to leave before dark. Once the sun sets, they'll be able to track us more easily." As they began to prepare for their escape, Jake couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. He'd never been in a fight like this before. Never had to run from an enemy so dangerous. But he had made a promise to Alisara, and he wasn't going to break that promise. The plan was simple, yet risky. They would leave the cabin at dusk, moving quickly and quietly through the woods, using the cover of darkness and the storm to hide their tracks. Once they reached the cliffs, they would take refuge in the cave Alisara mentioned and wait for the storm to pass, as they packed their things, warm clothing. Food, the small devices Alisara had shown him, Jake couldn't help but think about. How much had changed since Alisara had arrived? He had gone from living a quiet, solitary life to being caught in a fight for survival. And even though he was scared, even though he didn't know what would happen next, he felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't known before. Protecting Alisara had become more than just a task. It had become a mission, something that mattered. Deeply to him, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the snow-covered ground. The storm outside howled louder, as if nature itself was warning them. Jake and Alisara stood by the door, ready to leave. "You ready?" Jake asked, his voice steady but his heart racing. Alisara gave him a small smile. "Ready as I'll ever be." They stepped outside into the cold, the wind biting at their faces. The snow crunched under their feet as they made their way through the woods, staying close to each other. Alisara led the way, her movements quick and sure despite the cold. Jake followed closely behind, his senses alert for any signs of movement. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of the wind made him tense. But nothing happened. The storm seemed to cover their tracks, and the world around them was silent, save for the howl of the wind. They made good time reaching the foot of the cliffs. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, the cave was not far, just a short climb up the jagged rocks. Jake's muscles burned as he climbed, but he didn't stop. Alisara was ahead of him, her strength surprising him. She moved with the grace of someone who had spent years in dangerous environments. Once they were inside the cave, they took a moment to catch their breath. The cold outside felt distant, the warmth of the cave providing a much-needed comfort. "We'll stay here for the night," Alisara said, her voice low. "Tomorrow, we'll have to keep moving. They'll search the area, but they won't find us here not if we stay hidden." Jake nodded, sitting down against the cold stone wall of the cave. What happens next? Lasara looked at him, her expression unreadable. I don't know, but we'll keep moving. We'll keep fighting until they stop coming after me. But Jake didn't say anything. He knew there was no easy answer. The enemy would keep hunting them, and they would have to stay one step ahead. But for now, they were safe. They had made it to the cave, and that was something, as the storm raged outside. Jake and Alisara sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The cave, once just a place of refuge, now felt like a temporary home safe for the moment. But not for long. The danger wasn't over. The enemy was still out there, still looking for them. And Jake knew they would have to move quickly if they wanted to survive. But as he sat there in the quiet, watching the flickering shadows cast by their small fire, he realized that he wasn't alone anymore. He had Alisara, and for the first time in a long time, that thought gave him hope. The cave was cold, but the fire Jake had built kept the chill at bay. Outside, the storm raged on, its howls echoing through the mountains. Inside, the air was thick with tension, but also a strange peace. For the first time in days, they weren't on the run. They had made it here, together. And for that, Jake was grateful. As the night stretched on, they sat by the fire, each lost in their thoughts. Alisara's gaze kept drifting to the entrance of the cave, as though she were expecting something to happen at any moment. Jake didn't say anything. He knew what she was thinking. She was still worried. But there was nothing they could do. For now, except wait, Alisara, Jake said, breaking the silence. I know you're scared, but we've made it this far, and we'll keep going. Together. She looked at him, her eyes tired but filled with appreciation. I don't know what I would do without you, she said quietly. You've helped me more than anyone else ever has. Jake shrugged, trying to hide the warmth that spread through him at her words. I'm just doing what anyone would do. You would have done the same for me, she smiled, though it was small, like she was trying to hold back something deeper. Maybe, she said, but you didn't have to. You could have turned me away. I was a stranger, someone you knew nothing about. Jake leaned back against the stone wall, his eyes fixed on the flickering fire. I don't care about that. I couldn't just leave you out there in the cold. Alisara's gaze softened, and for a moment, Jake thought he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, something that felt deeper than gratitude. It was a look he hadn't seen before, one that made him feel both unsure and certain at the same time. Jake, she said after a long pause. I don't know what the future holds. I don't even know how long we can stay ahead of them. But I know this. I've never had anyone look out for me like you have, and I'll never forget it. Jake's heart thudded in his chest at her words. There was something about her, something in the way she looked at him that made him feel like this fight, this journey, was worth more than just survival. It was about something deeper, something unspoken, yet powerful. But he didn't have time to think about that now. The future was uncertain, and they had to focus on the immediate dangers. We'll figure it out, Jake said, his voice steady, one step at a time. The night passed slowly. They took turns keeping watch, but nothing happened. The enemy hadn't found them yet, and for that, Jake was thankful. He knew it wouldn't last forever, but he had to hold on to hope. He couldn't let Alisara down now. The next morning, they gathered their things and prepared to leave the cave. The storm outside had finally calmed, and the sky was clear. Alisara led the way, her steps sure and steady as they began the journey toward the next part of their escape route. Jake followed close behind, his eyes scanning the surrounding landscape for any sign of movement. For hours, they traveled in silence, moving through the wilderness with purpose. They were careful, staying off the main paths, and using the cover of trees and rocks to shield them from view. Alisara was quiet, focused on the path ahead, but Jake could tell she was more at ease now. She had regained some of her strength, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. As they reached the edge of the forest, Alisara stopped. She turned to Jake, her face thoughtful. We're close now. We'll be safe once we reach the next shelter. Jake nodded, his muscles sore from the long walk, but he didn't care. He was just happy they were still alive, still moving forward. But deep down, he knew that the real danger wasn't over. The enemy was still out there, still hunting them. They had to stay one step ahead. Alisara glanced at him, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Thank you, Jake, for everything." "Don't know how to repay you." Jake shook his head. "You don't need to. I'm just doing what feels right." But there was more to it than that. He knew it, and Alisara seemed to know it too. They continued their journey, moving quickly now, knowing that the shelter Alisara spoke of was close. The thought of it brought a sense of relief, but Jake didn't let his guard down. It learned that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The moment they stopped, the danger would be closer than ever as they reached the shelter, a small outpost hidden in the mountains. Alisara stopped again. She turned to Jake, her expression serious. "This is it," she said. "We'll be safe here for a while. But after that, we'll have to keep moving. The enemy won't give up until they find me." Jake nodded, understanding the reality of the situation, but for now, they were safe. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to relax. He knew that, no matter what happened, they had each other. They had made it this far, and they would keep fighting. Together, the door to the shelter creaked open, and they stepped inside, greeted by the warmth of the fire and the comfort of safety, even if it was only temporary. For the first time in a long time, Jake allowed himself to believe that things could get better. For now, the future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they weren't alone anymore. And that made all the difference.